Just mute. Okay, thank you for joining me again. We'd made a long route through a Mishnah last week. That Mishnah was on Mem Hey Amud Aleph 45a, Mitzvah Sarova. We did some unusual Gemara last week, and we'll be doing some Purim Torah this week as well, as we move over from a halacha mentioned in the Mishnah into a parallel halacha, which really derives from the Mishnah, which is very much in season. Just to remind you, last week we spent quite a long time on Kabbalah because the Mishnah on Daf Mem Hey Amud Aleph had described the tefillos that accompanied the Arava ceremony in the Beis Hamikdash. And when they took these very long aravot and they made a hakofa of the Mizbeh in the Beis Hamikdash, and then they placed those aravos against the side of the Mishkan, of the Mizbeh, overhanging it. And the Mishnah told us that as they did so, they used to sing, Honor Hashem Hoshiana, Honor Hashem Hatzlichana. But Rabbi Yehuda came in and he said, as an alternative to Honor Hashem Hoshiana, what they proclaimed was Ani V'ho Hoshiana. So very quickly, I'll just share screen just to shake up your memory a little bit. I think we should be sharing. And I showed you the magic 3 psukim in the Torah on which this alternative proclamation of Ani V'ho Hoshiana are based. And I reminded you that there were 3 psukim in the introductory psukim to Kriyas Yamsuf. Each of them 72 letters. And if you placed Posuk 1 over Posuk 2 and Posuk 2 over Posuk 3 and took all the gaps away, and you just put them as a continuous statement, each Posuk, all 72 across each line, as I've done over here, with the second Posuk actually written backwards just to make things more complicated, then I reminded you that you had Vaho reading downwards as a triplet, Vav, Hey, Vav. And in the middle, you have Aleph, Nun, Yud, Ani. And so out of the 72 vertical triplets, 2 of them were the ones chosen, Ani Vaho. And I gave you an explanation as to why just these 2 rather than any other read downwards triplet were chosen. Ani Vaho was chosen, which is the first and the 37th as you go along. So this is all a Kabbalistic idea. The 72 letter name of God is something that figures in Kabbalah, and that these psukim somehow embedded in them are the 72 letter names of God. Over here we have 3 psukim of 72 letters, but that more than just reading across do we get 72 letters, we also get 72 variant triplets as you read downwards, which are just as significant as the 72 letters read across. And instead of Honor Hashem Hoshiana, Rabbi Yehuda said that these 2 are significant, and they were read Ani V'ho. This is very unusual in terms of a piece of Gemara, or even in terms of the source for a tefillah. But nevertheless, this is what the Mishnah is telling us, according to Rashi, because none of this explanation I've just given you is at all apparent from the words of the Mishnah itself. The Mishnah only told us that Rabbi Yehuda had an alternative rendering, Ani V'ho. But the Mishnah didn't tell you where the Ani V'ho came from. And it was only this explanation given by Rashi and backed up by Tosfos and other Rishonim, which gives us the origin of Ani V'ho. And as I also said, if you take part in the Arava ceremony that we have today on Hoshana Rabbah at Shul, and there's some very long tefillas there, which we proclaim just prior to bashing of our Aravot. And we say Ani V'ho Hoshiana a few times, and that's taken from this Mishnah. So next time you actually use that, use your siddur and you actually say those words, if you've got the time and patience to say all the words, think about how the origin is this strange a Kabbalistic set of 72 letters, through Psukim with 72 letters. The Mishnah went on, and we briefly talked about what the Kohanim said as a goodbye message to the Mizbeh. It was rather an unusual Mishnah. It said they used to say goodbye to the Mizbeh, Yofi L'cha Mizbeh, all the beauty of the ceremony that we've just practiced around the Mizbeh. With the Arava, it says is due to you. L'cha L'cha Mizbeh, L'cha L'cha Mizbeh. This is all a respect to you and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then the Mishnah went on to talk a little about the ceremony, how that differed on Shabbos, that the Arabas were actually gathered from Motzah in the morning, the evening of Thursday, of Friday before Shabbos comes in, and they used to leave those in the Beis Midrash in golden buckets so that they wouldn't dry up, so that the ceremony of the Arava could be carried out on the Shabbos, when in order to carry out this Arava ceremony on Shabbos, they weren't going to pick those Aravas on Shabbos morning. They had to be picked on Friday. Now, right at the end, there was a peculiar sentence, and I briefly studied this with you last week. I'm going to pick up on that again, which is the last statement in the Mishnah. So in your Mishnah, which is roughly in the middle of Daf Mehei Omid Aleph, just before the Gemara, where you see Gimel Mem, the last verse there, 3 lines above the Gimel Mem, the last word is Miyad Tinokas Shom Tinis Lulavehen for Ochlin Esrogehen. Esrogehen, right in the middle of the Omid, is the last word before the Gemara, the big Gimel Mem. So without any a proper introduction, the Gemara goes straight on to how everything ends. It does so, and it's only by reading the commentaries you can see what this is all about, literally translating these words in the Mishnah. It says, Miyad hatinokos, from the hand of the young kids. Tinok nowadays means like a baby, tinok. But in this is an Aramaic Lashon. It's there today in Ivrit, it's only there because it's been imported from the Aramaic. And in the Aramaic, a tinuk means a child. Doesn't have to mean a baby. It can mean a child of 3 or 4 years old or 5 years old as well, before he or she really knows to be able to speak articulately. Miyad hatinokos shom tinas lulavehen. From the hands of the tinokos, we let slip their lulavim. Ochlin v'ochlin es esrogehen, and we eat their esrogim. And I think I explained to you last week, it isn't at all clear what this means. Is it actually the hands of the tinokos, the children's hands that are doing something? Are we doing something to their hands? It says miyat hatinokos, from the hands of the tinokos. There we let slip, or we actually another way of looking at it is we snatch their lulavim. We snatch the lulavim away from the kids. This is the end of Yom Tov. Everyone's done all they need to do with their lulav and esrog. What more remains to be done other than putting everything away, tidying up, and clearing the house, bringing everything back from the sukkah into the house? So we take away their lulavim, if you like, and we eat their esrogim, because the understanding over here is that children also may have had a lulav and esrog. We learned earlier on that when a child knows already how to do the na'anuim, this is one of the criteria for minimum age for arba minim. As soon as they're able to do these things, they understand what they're doing. They can hold a lulav and an esrog in their hands, and they know that they ought to turn forward, back, sideways, etc. Even if they don't know why they're doing it, it is already time to endow them with their own set of lulavim and esrogim. Now, we're careful about doing it nowadays, but there's some people buy lulavim and esrogim for children even at a young age. They may not be muhudar, but they may be kosher, because this is all part of the mitzvah of chinuch. But when it comes to the end of Yom Tov, we take it away from them. That seems to be what the Mishnah is saying. Why does the Mishnah have to tell you this? Do we ever get told what we do at the end of the Yom Tov? Is there a Mishnah at the end of Pesachim that says when Pesach is over, we change the tablecloths and we go out and buy the cereal? You seem to be saying something similar over here. It's somewhat puzzling that we need to be told what ritual we need to undergo to rid the kids of their lulav and esrogim. Just use your common sense. Why is this a Mishnah? So that itself is not clear, by the way. It's not clear why this is significant. Even with a Rishonim, it's not clear. But rather, the commentaries go into what is a tangential detail, rather than explaining why the principle of this statement is really needed. And I took you briefly through the Tosfos then, who quotes Rashi. And this was all to do with the fact that even though the lulav and esrog belong to the child, when Yom Tov is over, you may take the lulav and esrog away, and you don't need their permission. And this will not be considered gezel. Very big chiddush, it seems, over here, the Mishnah is telling you. At the end of Yom Tov, the lulav and esrog that belonged to the child, midrabanan, they have a kinyan. Midrabanan, they have a kinyan. You don't have to ask them kindly to return the lulav and esrog to mommy and daddy so that they can put them away in a cupboard somewhere, or throw away, or burn the lulav and eat the esrog. You may do so without their permission. You may snatch them from them. That's what the Mishnah is telling us, according to Rashi. And what I want to do is share with you the Tosfos that I did with you very briefly, and then carry that Tosfos further to see what its ramifications are. So I'm going to share screen. With the Tosfos is actually on your page on the left-hand column, but I've magnified it over here and I've put it into square print for those who don't like reading Rashi print. So here's the statement in the Mishnah. Miyad tinokos shomtin lulavehen. From the hands of the children, we snatch away their lulavim. Actually, it's a clumsy piece of language over here. You might have expected to say, shomtim lulavim midei hatinokos. If I was writing the Mishnah, I would write it with better grammar. And that itself is a clue that this may not be the only way to learn this statement in the Mishnah. But let's carry on understanding it the way I've explained it so far, that we take the lulavim, the esrogim, away from the kids. So here, first of all, Tosfos is doing no more than quoting Rashi word for word. But let's do it again to remind ourselves. Lulavei hatinokos, the lulavim of the kids, shomten hagedolin miyodom, the adults take away from out of their hands, the ochlin esrogehim shotunokos, and they also are able to take their esrogim away from the kids and to eat them. For ein bedova gezel, and there is no chashash here that this is a form of theft, that you're thieving something. The kid doesn't want you. The kid wants to play knights in armor and use his lulav for jousting. He wants to use his esrogim for pelleting his friend, and he's not allowed to do that. You may take this away from him. And there's no problem in terms of theft when you do such a thing. The lo mishum darkei shalom, says Rashi as well here. This is Tosfos quoting him. Neither is it in any way a problem with the principle of darkei shalom, which means ensuring that there are peaceful relationships, like a bit like shalom bayis. What do you want to call a machlokas with your child? By doing this, he wants to play with the lulav. Why are you taking it away? There's no problem. You can take it away. There's no conflict with the principle of darkei shalom. Why? And a shekach nahagubo, this is what people used to do at the end of a festival, machmas simcha, because of the notion of simcha. Simcha, as part of the, again, I'm not sure what this has got to do with simcha. To end the festival, there is a notion of simcha, and it's almost a bit of teasing and fun. So you say it's all over when you speak to your little boy, and you take his little esrog away, and you give him instead a football or a baseball bat or something like that in exchange. Part of this simcha process is that you take away the the lulav and esrog. He'll understand it, and you'll understand it. It's all a bit of a joke. And because it's a joke, that does not conflict with the principles of gezel. And it doesn't conflict with the principles of Darkei Shalom. Now, this is not at all easy to understand in Londis, as we will see later on, because supposing I play a joke on a friend of mine who happens to own something which is of great value, and I snatch it from him and I run away, and I think it's all a big joke and he'll understand it. Does that not conflict with the principles of Gezel and Darkei Shalom? It does. You are not allowed to steal as a matter of a joke or as a matter of a tease. However, in this context, Rashi and Tosfos confirming it really are saying that you may do this, and it is understandable and reasonable under the circumstances Motzi Sukkot. Kach Pirish B'Kuntras. So far, he's explained Rashi. This is what Kuntras is Rashi. V'yesh lilmod mikan. So here's where Tosfos goes on his own, and he says one may learn from this halacha that you may snatch away the lulav and esrog from kids, and because this is part of a sort of a post-festival game, it's understood, and it doesn't conflict with any principles of Gezel Darkei Shalom. You may extrapolate that to la'osen bochurim, to those young lads sherochvim besusim, that ride on their horses likras choson, in order to meet the choson on the wedding day as part of the ceremonial of simchas choson b'kala, the nilchamim zeh im zeh, and they do battle with each other on horseback. They joust. We're talking about Tosfos in medieval times. He's talking about a little playful joust. The kor in begdo shel chavero, and they even, by so doing, they tear and damage the clothing of their fellow man during the friendly tassels. Oh, mekalkel lo suso, or even damage and injure his horse in the process. Shehem paturin, that they are patur, they're exempt from having to pay damages, because it's all a playful joust. So what Tosfos is saying over here, which is again not so obvious, is that you can extrapolate from the case of the lulav and esrog snatching. Since you don't have, it's not considered to be gezel or a problem with Darkei Shalom to snatch from your child, because this is all part of a mitzvah type simcha at the end of the Chag. So also you would be patur and exempt from damages that you might cause to your fellow man if you're playfully acting up and damaging them. Because they used to do these playful jousts on account of simchas choson b'kala. Okay, so that's the first thing. On this basis, Tosfos has derived this halacha, which is, if you like, quite an extrapolation from that of snatching the lulav and esrog from a child, that you can even cause damage to people, and we'll see later on, possibly even injure them, as long as it's part of a friendly joust, a playful ceremony. Now, this is a very, very big principle to take in, because it's not at all obvious that that should be allowed. But let's carry on with this for the time being. But now Tosfos comes out with the Ojiei Shloma, which is an alternative explanation. And this is going to be quite important, because this alternative explanation is going to look at these words, miyad tinokos shomtin lulevehem, in a different way. And when we look at it this way, the derivation we've just made about the heta, the fact that we're allowed to damage people if it's all part of a playful simcha ceremony, evaporates. We will not be able to make or draw that conclusion based from an alternative reading of miyad tinoka shomtin lulevehem. So what's this alternative reading? For Ojiei Shloma, one could learn the Mishnah differently. Damas nisin lo iri klal sheyachtafu hagadolin miyadon shel tinokas. The Mishnah never means to tell us that you can snatch a lulav and esrog at the end of the yontif from your child. In other words, you can't. One is not allowed to snatch the lulav and esrog from a child because that is gezel. It is it is a conflict with Darkei Shalom, and therefore there is no way you could extend this to say that you're allowed to playfully joust in front of a chosen and kala, tear their clothing and damage their horses. It's all not true according to this alternative explanation. So what does it mean? Miyad tanoka shomtun leleveim. Ella, what it means is miyad kloma la'alter tinoka shomtun lelevei atzmon mitoch harav. Listen to this alternative explanation. Miyad does not mean, according to this explanation, which we found a bit difficult anyway, to mean from the hands of children. This starts the posuk the wrong way. It should have said, as I say to you, shomtim lulaveim, the verb should come first. You snatch the lulavim miyad tinokas. So according to Tosfos' alternative explanation, miyad does not mean from the hands of. When we use the word miyad nowadays in Hebrew, what does it mean? Immediately. That's what it means. La'alter. I will do this immediately. That's what it means. Now read it. Miyad, immediately after Yom Tov, comma, Tinoka shomtun lelevehem, children will put away their lulavim. Why? Because they're sharp, they cause damage, and they will eat their own esrogim. I'll stop sharing over here. What a remarkable turnaround. According to this alternative explanation, miyad does not mean from the hands of, it means immediately. Now we have two ways of learning this very simple statement at the end of the Mishnah. The one that we first learned in Rashi, gives us this extraordinary conclusion and consequence that as long as something is done, as part of a playful ceremony, as, if you like, the back product of a mitzvah, all hell can break loose. You can damage people, you can knock them off the horse, you can damage their horse, no damage is needed. Let them stew in their own juices. That's the explanation. That is the halacha that is implied from one version of reading this innocent statement at the end of the Mishnah. The alternative reading of the Mishnah doesn't give us that conclusion at all. It simply means, as a matter of fact, that at the end of the Yom Tov, the children now can use, they can take their lot of them away, or they can use them for anything they want to. That's all it means. They have no value. It's immediately after Yom Tov, the kids can do what they want with they can put them away because they're damaging, they can use them as swords, they can do what they want. It's now their own plaything anymore, which it wasn't during Yom Tov. I just wanted to make clear to you how different the explanations can be of this Mishnah, and they have halachic consequences that extend way outside the lulav and esrog. They extend to what you can do in any mitzvah ceremony. If you learn the second opinion of Tosfos, there is no license to do anything damaging under any circumstances. If you learn according to the first version of Tosfos, which Rashi promotes, it gives us license to do all sorts of naughty things when Purim comes on the scene in a few days' time. So let me take it further now by sharing with you. It's actually a very long, we will sort of do the highlights of it because it is of great interest as part of this Technicolor extension of the Shir. Purim damages, Rabbi Yeshua Pfeffer. It's a Talmud Chacham, still alive. He's not, we're not talking about an ancient sefer. So he was asked all sorts of kashas that essentially stem from this Mishnah. So let's read a bit. I've highlighted some of it for you. Consider the following question. Which many of us, English, he must be American, have experienced in one form or another. A group of tipsy teenagers barges into a house on Purim, collecting money for some worthy cause and drinks for themselves. As they dance boisterously around the living room table to the amusement of guests and the concern of the host, one member of the merry group brushes against a glass, causing it to fall and smash. Now, what happens with the broken glass? The boy who caused the damage recalls the affair and wishes to know if he's liable to pay for the damage. Is he? Second. So this goes on. Wedding jewels and playful snatching. Remember wedding jewels? We've just done this in Tosfos. This is our Tosfos. The Mishnah Sukkah 45a, our Mishnah, based on Rashi's interpretation that on the final day of Sukkot, the people of Jerusalem used to snatch the 4 species from the hands of children and eat the esrogim. Rashi explains that this practice does not transgress the prohibition of Gezel. The reason for this is that this was the common custom, and that therefore there is tacit universal agreement to permit the practice. By the way, I want to point out that it wasn't so clear in Rashi or Tosfos that what he's saying is right in this statement. The way I understood Rashi and Tosfos was that this was the practice because it was a mitzvah, and it was a simcha shel mitzvah. He's adding a point over here, which is also quite interesting, which is, since we are talking about doing these things for a mitzvah, and it became a custom. It became a custom. It became an embedded custom. When there is a custom, people understand what game they're playing. So therefore, if you have, for example, 2 jousters riding on horseback, each of them knows the risks they're taking, and each of them knows that this is just a playful joust. And therefore, even though one may be damaged at the end of the joust, they will have taken that into account at the beginning, and they will be mochel, they will waive their rights to damage. Because this is the way you celebrate a chosen and a color. That's what he's saying. And this is no more than Tosfos. Okay, so Tosfos offers an alternative explanation for the Midrash, according to which no snatching took place. Rather, the children would eat their own esrogim and not take anybody else's. According to this second interpretation, there is no source for exemptions from damage liability in cases of common wedding jewels. And this is exactly what I explained to you before. The source for exemption stems from the first explanation. Okay, so there's a machlokus on this, based upon the halachas itself, or a machlokus based upon whether the posek is going to follow the first interpretation or the second. The principle that there is an exemption from liability for damages that arises from customary playfulness is extended to Purim by the Trumas Hadeshin. This is where we get into Turim. So therefore, Purim, somebody who playfully snatches food and the like on Purim, according to that first interpretation of Tosfos, is exempt from liability. During the rest of the year, such snatching would be considered gezel. On Purim, however, it is permitted since it is part of the Purim festive atmosphere. Now, it's interesting. He says over here, the Beis Yosef, who is the Shulchan Aruch, writes that this custom no longer applies, and that therefore there are no grounds for exemption from damage liability on Purim. And Ramah does mention the ruling in the name of Yesh Omrim. In other words, in the Shulchan Aruch, there's more than one opinion as to whether there is exemption or there isn't exemption, and it's all based upon how you're going to learn the Mishnah, which side of Tosfos you're going to fall on. Let's extend it now to physical damage and bodily injury. So far, we've been talking about property damage. Does this exemption for customary damage apply even to bodily harm? And he says the answer depends on the rationale behind the exemption. And so he says, if the reason is that we're mochel each other, that essentially we waive property damage, then that will apply also for physical damage. This implies that the custom and the sources above is not merely a matter of mechila, the foregoing of payment on the part of the victim. Rather, we consider it as though there was no offense at all. Although the victim made no statement to this effect, it is as if the snatching or damaging is done with his permission. He goes on to say, essentially, this is also an interesting extension. When a person punches you in the face on a Purim, and it's all part of a friendly Purim spiel, he's essentially, according to the most extreme interpretation, done no offense at all. It's even though he didn't say to you, can I punch you on the face? Do you realize as a result of Purim, if I damage you, that you have no recourse for damages? And you don't say, yes, I know that. He never actually poses this question to you. He punches you straight in the face. It is as if you had waived the idea that it's an offense at all. In other words, after he's punched you in the face, you should smile at him and say, you had always agreed to this. and to the damage that falls from it. Let's go on in mind with Purim damages. There are more rules. He's the posik that we follow normally in Ashkenaz, is someone damages another person during and on account of Purim festival festivities, he's exempt from liability. Watch out this Purim. Yet, in view of the sources above, this will only apply to cases where the damage was customary, meaning normal and to a degree that is predictable under the circumstances. In such instances, the one who damaged is exempt from both the prohibition against causing the damage and the obligation to pay. A typical example of this is when one person inadvertently steps on his fellow's shoe during a Purim dance, tearing the sole from the upper leather. Actually, no, this very often happens, I have to tell you, on Simchas Torah. It's when you're going around and there's a lot of pushing and shoving. I've had quite a lot of injuries to my big toe. Can I sue the person in front of me who's been jumping up and down with great aplomb with a bottle of whiskey in his hand? The answer is no. It's the same as Purim. According to this view, this is part of the customary simcha. It is well known that your toe is vulnerable on a Simchas Torah. However, if, for example, in a Simchas Torah, we have someone who says he's going to play with a box of matches and some petroleum spirit and he burns down your house, then that would be, according to the view we've just seen here, extraordinary damages, not to be considered within the parameters of a normal simcha activity, and he would then be liable. So extreme forms of damage wouldn't apply. He goes on to say, note that this applies only to damage that is caused in the context of a Purim celebration. Someone who becomes drunk on Purim and causes damage without any connection to a Purim feast will be liable for damages. Now, what that means, and this is also interesting, you have a guy who's drunk. It's customary to be drunk on Purim. If he causes damage in the context of a Purim Suda or Simcha, that's one thing, and that he may be exempt from. But suppose he walks out into the street and he uses his bottle to smash the window of a house. He just randomly passes. That is not within the context of a Purim Simcha, and you will be able to take him to a Din Torah under those circumstances for the damage he causes. Moreover, the Mishnah Berurah rules that significant damages are not included. The customary damages are limited to small claims. As we said before, not extraordinary claims. It is also noteworthy that according to the Aruch HaShulchan, the customary Purim exertion from tort liability does not apply today, since such boundless celebration is no longer the norm. Now, that is actually very highly contested. In many places, it is the norm. The Aruch HaShulchan was writing maybe where people were much more, much more reserved and contained, and there wasn't that much drunkenness and revelry. But in a society where there is drunkenness and revelry on a Purim, then that Purim exemption would apply, because a person is acting within what is customary in that society. Charity collectors who cause damage, very common. In other words, the people who go around with, from the cars, dash into their houses and cause a mayhem. The spielers. Will this exemption extend to drunken youth who enter a house for the purpose of collecting charity? So he says here, unlike customary duels and dances, it is perhaps more difficult to see a homeowner as telling the entire world, break my possessions and be exempt. People generally don't want drunkards running wild in their homes, even on Purim. Now, that's actually interesting because, of course, many wealthy households leave their houses open because they are inviting spielers in. So if you invite spielers into your home, you can hardly say, hey, I don't want people coming into my house and causing damage. I don't mind people in the house causing damage, but you're from the outside. I don't know you from Adam. It's not so clear. You leave your house open and you enjoy spielers, and spielers are coming in and they're queuing outside, they cause damage, may well be that they're exempt. Similarly, rationale whereby the sages exempted a person from damage will apply to regular circumstances and may not apply to people who walk into others' houses, and that's what it says may, But if the person invites them in, it's hard to say that's different. It is hard to give a general ruling, and every case has to be weighed based on the specific circumstances. The difference between wild frivolity and Purim celebration is key. Even where a person will be exempt, it is recommended practice for the perpetrator of the damage to offer payment out of decency, as well as out of possible halachic obligation. He's really hedging his bets here, say, well, if you can tell me what the line is between wild frivolity and Purim celebration, then you'll be able to paskin li sheilot. But it's very difficult to draw that line. He then goes on to one interesting extension. An interesting and pertinent issue that follows from our discussion in the halakhic status is the halakhic statements of stains that we occasionally pick up through wine spills at communal events. In a crowded hall, with everybody vying for a good position at a table, everybody wants to pick up a plate of cholent, or their arms go over each other's shoulders trying to get to the schmorzgebord table, and they're shorter than everybody else. And in your hands, you find hands around underneath you and everywhere. It is virtually inevitable that somebody will spill some food or drink on another Shabbos clothes. If the person who spills a cup of food on somebody else's clothes liable to pay the dry cleaning bill? Based on the foregoing discussion, such damage might be considered customary, since it is almost inevitable. So the person who perpetrates the damage will be exempt. Yes, this is very much contingent on specific circumstances of each case, and a halachic authority should always be consulted. It goes without saying that Purim exemptions only apply to somebody who causes damage without intent. Likewise, someone who knows that his nature is to cause damage when drunk must take prior preventative measures, and he must not become drunk if he knows this will lead to damages. Again, this is a very difficult point. I'll just quit sharing at this point, because what it appears to be saying is that some people know their characters better than others. And if they know that they're very often involved in damages when they're drunk, they themselves should not visit other persons' premises, because it'll become inevitable. We're talking here about customary levels of damage and levels of damage which are not predictable. But if it's something almost is obvious for an individual, that as soon as he drinks some whiskey, he smashes bottles and then he stabs them with the sharp end, then I don't think he can claim that this is part of the customary level of frivolity that everybody should be prepared to entertain in his company on Purim or on any other day. I thought the interesting extra was actually with the stains, etc. We going to a kiddush, we often find that someone does spill or put some schmaltz herring on one's suits, and that can be an expensive suit to try and clean. What you're learning from here, again, this is all according to the first explanation of Tosfos, where he talks about the fact that this is referring in our Mishnah to stealing from your kids, that this whole halachic exemption can even apply. According to that, it may well be that the person who you've stained can just say, you can just say to them, I'm sorry, quote the Mishnah here, quote the explanation of Tosfos, and you're not at all liable to pay. He may not like you for it, but you're not liable to pay. According to that second explanation, remember, none of this applies at all. Every form of damage is a problem. However, it does seem from all the explanations we brought, all the different halakhic positions, that the Tosfos's two views have been decided in favor of the first, which is Rashi's. That it does mean that you can snatch from your kids, which means you can commit theft in certain circumstances, which means you can commit damage and injury in certain circumstances. It is that first view that seems to prevail over here, and that second view, which would not allow you to do these forms of damage, seems to have been almost put into the sideline. So again, as I say, beware on Purim, beware the Ides of March. Okay, that takes us to the end of the Mishnah, and I've shared with you what I think is a very interesting discussion here on damages. And I'm going to start the Gemara now. We're actually going to go forward. So let's move on to the first line of the Gemara. The Gemara says, Tana Makom Kalanya Hava V'Tana Didan Mai Kari La Motza This is something I actually explained when we did the Mishnah itself. In the Mishnah itself started talking about the ceremony of the Arava by saying that the long Aravot that were used in the Beis HaMikdash were collected from this little village called Motza at outside Yerushalayim. And there were lots of wonderful willow trees there. And that's where the Kohanim, or the Shlichei Beis HaMikdash, went down to cut off these Arovim. And this place was called Motza. And I mentioned to this last time as we were doing the beginning of the Mishnah. The Gemara actually gives us a bit of a historical description of place names. And it says, Makom Kolonia Hava. The place actually was called Kolonia, which means colony. Why was it called Motza in our Mishnah? Because because it was taken out of the tax zone of the king. So it was called Motza. Lahotzi, Motzi, Motzi lechem min haaretz, one who brings, draws out bread from the ground, so to speak. So Motza means it was drawn out of the tax zone. In other words, it was a tax-free area, and that's why it was called Motza. Why was it called? Why was it a tax-free area? Because it was the station for a battalion of Roman soldiers, and it had the status of being a Roman colony within Eretz Yisrael at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. And because it was the home base for a legion of Roman soldiers, it had this tax-free status. There were Romans mostly living there. There were also Jews, and the Jews could go down and they could pick things out. And it was called Colonia because it was a colony. It was considered a bit like a colony. A colony is an overseas protectorate, which is really your own. And the Romans outside Rome had colonies. I mean, the whole of Eretz Yisrael could be considered a colony, but an area in which they were specifically stationed would have been called colony, colonia. It was their colonia, and therefore it was outside of the tax system. And you might ask yourself the question, why does the Mishnah decide to attribute a name which has got to do with tax? Why did they keep the name colonia? I mean, how is the name Motza more holy as a name to be rendered in the Mishnah? Because it's tax-free? Is it important for me as a learner of Torah to know that it was outside the tax system? I can't answer that question, but it was outside the tax system. And you can imagine that nowadays people would go down there and buy their ovens and fridges because there would be no VAT levied on it. But that's what it was outside the tax system. Now, our Mishnah went on and explained that Arava ceremony, which I've described to you so many countless times, but this is the source Mishnah which mentioned it. And the Gemara is going to discuss this a little bit. And in so doing, is going to give us a very interesting description of the Mizbeh. Don't forget, this Arava ceremony was very much related to the Mizbeh. Nowadays, we don't have a Mizbeh, and we may do hakafos around the bima in the shul, but the equivalent of their Hoshana ceremony, the Arava ceremony, was to carry these around, these long Aravot around the Mizbeh, and then place them against the side of the Mizbeh. So the Mizbeh was central to the Arava ceremony. We'll see how that plays out in a moment. The Gemara starts by quoting the Mishnah, Uvo'in v'sokven oson b'tzidei, etc. It would go on to say b'tzidei ha-Mizbeh, that the Kohanim on that day, on each day, when the Arava ceremony was carried out, they would eventually they would erect these long Aravas against the sides of the Mizbeh. That's what the Mishnah said. And I said to you already on many occasions, this shows that the Aravos must have been very tall, because the Mizbeh was about 15 feet high. So we're not talking about little mini Aravos that we stick into our lulav. So now the Brisa takes this up and says the following: Tana was taught in a Brisa about these Aravot, that they were I think the Mishnah, the Gemara actually says, as you read it here, we will actually translate it differently. If you read your brisa here, it says, Rabos va'aruchos v'gevohos. Rabos, which means many, v'aruchos and lengthy, long, v'gevohos and high, echad asa amma, 11 amos high. That was the height of the araba, so that they would be able to overhang the top of the Mizbeh, the roof of the Mizbeh. They were 11 amos high. And the Gemara is going to explain why they had to be 11 amos high, not 12, not 4, not 9, in a moment. However, as an emendation, we'll change the word rabos, which is still what you see here, to rakos, because the various hagaot, the amendment experts in the language of the Gemara say that it should really read rakos, which means soft. Somewhere along the line, the kaf was mistaken for a base. And therefore, what we have in our rendering here is rabot. And very commonly, as I mentioned to you many times, we see that there are amendments that are not made into the Gemara, even though they were known to the printers of Gemara for hundreds of years, but somehow they preserved the daf format of the Vilna Shas, or whatever original Shas, that this particular version of Shas that you may be looking at, and I imagine it says Rabos, I don't remember, I'm using a different Gemara to the one I photocopied for you if you're looking for photocopies, but if it says Rabos, then it should read Rakos, and that error was hard-coded for time immemorial. However, it should say rakos, soft. They were soft and supple, and they were lengthy, and they were 11 amos high. Why? Kedei sheyehu gochos al hamizbeach hamar. In order that they should be sufficiently long to be able to overhang and be bowed over the roof of the mizbeach. Let's assume they're standing on the ground. You have the base of the stem of the arava on the ground, and it has to be long enough that it extends the full height of the mizbeach and can still overhang horizontally, if you like, over the gag by an amma, without actually touching the surface of the mizbeach. We'll see in a moment. In other words, they overhang the roof of the mizbeach. They don't brush against the horizontal roof of the Mizbeh. They're taller than the Mizbeh. Okay, how do we know this and what does it look like? So let's go further. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a whole extent, maybe 4 or 5 lines of the next Gemara, and translate it quickly. And then I'm going to show you pictures and diagrams galore that will explain the following Gemara, because the Gemara now is going to give you dimensions of length and width and heights and angles and stuff like that, and it'll all be one blur. So let's just read the whole passage together, and then we'll see what it means. Amara Merema Mishum Mazutra. Merema said in the name of the Mazutra, Shema Mina, one has to conclude from the fact that the Aravas were 11 amas high, and no more. One has to conclude al hayusod manachlahu, that the aravas were not placed on the ground, but rather they were placed on a ledge of the mizbeach, which was an amma above the ground. I'll carry on. De'isal kadat a'ara manachlahu, because if you say these long aravas were actually based on the ground and not on that ledge, michti. So let's have a look and think about it. Does that make sense? The Mishnah in Midrash describes the Mizbeach in the following way. Allah Amma, from measuring from the ground up, the Mizbeach moves up vertically 1 amma. In fact, in other words, the wall of the Mizbeach starts to go up from the ground from 1 amma. The Kanos Amma. And then at the end of that amma, there is an inset of an amma horizontal, which constitutes a ledge. And then Allah Chamesh, it carries on vertically the wall of the Mizbeach, inset a bit, by 5 amos, and then chonos amma. And then it goes in again, it's inset further by an amma, another ledge, if you like. Zehu sovev, that second inset or second ledge is called sovev. Allah shalosh, then it goes up another 3 amos vertically, and zehu makoma chronos, and it reaches the position at which the corners of the horns of the Mizbeh are set. So, gochos al gabi Mizbeh, hechi nishkachach la. If that is the case, how would an 11 amma high arava ever overhang the Mizbeach by an amma? How can it do so? And the bright Mishnah says it does. It won't if you do the measurement, which we will do. Ella lav shma mina. Must one not conclude from here that the bottom of the arava stem stood on the yesod, the first ledge, 1 amma higher above the ground, and the Gemara says shma mina, we must indeed conclude that way. It's all very clear, isn't it, when you read this brisa? So now let me try and share with you some diagrams that I hope will clarify. Well, let me start with this. This is the famous old picture you've seen countless times. Here you see a very long arava, and it's overhanging. You see it's much higher than the Mizbeh. This doesn't actually explain what we're looking at very accurately, but let me just sort of explain in a distorted sense what it's doing. It has to be higher than the Mizbeh, and it has to overhang it. So it essentially droop over, and it does not comb or brush against the roof because it's higher than the roof. It's soft enough to droop over. That's why it's a rakos, but it's very long. And we're saying that these had to be at least 11 amas high. 11 amas high is about 15, 16 feet, which you can see. Here's a 6-foot Cohen or whatever, and it's about 3 times his height. Maybe this is a bit more than 11 amas, what we see depicted over here, but the scale is not bad. The first thing you can see over here, by the way, is you can see the insets, the ledges. Here you can see the second ledge. Here, right, it goes up vertically, it goes in a bit, and then you see a second wall above it, so to speak. It's like a layers on a wedding cake. And there's a tiny layer at the bottom, which is this first ledge, which is 1 amma high. Now let's have a look at it again, and you can see it more clearly, right? So here you see the Mizbeh, if you like, from a side top view. Here's the ramp. Here's the top with the wood, etc. You don't see any arava over here, but I want you to look very carefully in what you see. You see a bottom ledge, which is near the ground. It just looks like a base. But that ledge at the bottom, this white line, is called the yesod. Then there's another 5, and it's 1 amma above the ground. Then you go up another 5 ammas, and you get to the second ledge, which is called the sovev, which is 3, which also goes in 1 amma. And the final elevation is another 3 ammas that takes you to the height of the corner pieces, the horns. These are the horns, these projections, vertical projections. So how high is this in total? 1, just look at the vertical height, plus 5, plus 3. So 1 to the top of the first ledge. There's another 5 here, and then there's another 3. 1 and 5 is 6, and 3 is 9. A total height of 9 ammas that would take you to the roof, the horizontal level of the roof. That's 9 above the ground. Okay. Look at it again. You can see it even more clearly here. You see that first ledge. So it's 1 amma, 5 ammas, 3 ammas. Right? Okay. So it's built in layers, and each layer is inset by horizontally by 1 amma. This first one is 1 amma high and inset by 1. Then they have 5 and then 1, and then you have 3. That's a total of 9. Okay. What is the Mishnah telling us? The Mishnah is, or rather, what is Mazutra telling us? Name of Mazutra. He's saying that if you do the calculations and you understand the shape of the Mizbeh, it is impossible with an 11 amma arava to achieve it standing on the ground, leaning against the Mizbeh, overhanging it, with 1 amma to spare. That won't work out. The only way the dimensions will work out that 11 will be high enough is if the arava stands on this first ledge, which is 1 amma above the ground. So it only has to go up 5 and 3, 8, and then you'll find it's enough. Why is that? So let me just, for a moment, I'm going to stop share and share again and use a whiteboard. So what you have over here, you have it going up 1 amma. You have an inset of an amma. It goes up 5. You have an inset of an amma. An inset is always 1. It goes up 3. Ooh, very bad drawing. And then you meet, so to speak, the top of the Mizbeach. I hope you like that drawing. 1 second. Just choose another pen. Okay. Now, what's the arava? Now, let's just write these in again. The size, that's 1. That's 5. It's very difficult working like this, but it's a lot of fun, I can tell you. That's 3. Yeah, 3 and 5, 8, 1's 9. Okay. Now you have your arava. How is your arava going to sit? The way the Gemara understands it, there is a problem, because it's got this, the arava has to take a diagonal, doesn't it? Because there's an inset, and the arava is not going virtually upwards and then like that. It's not standing like a lamppost. It's going to have to lean. So it's going to have to stand a little bit further like that, and very, very badly drawn. And what the Gemara, what Mar Zutra is claiming is that 11, this is the arava, would not be long enough for this structure, because it's got to go at least 1 amma above, and also, according to the way the Gemara understands it, I think, it has to overhang vertically 1. This is 1, not 7. All right? So you've got 1 and 1 is 2. And 3, that's 5. And 5 is 10. And 1 is 11. But it's not enough. Because if it was all vertical, it would be enough. This is at a diagonal. We've got a hypotenuse. So you'll need 11 and a bit. Therefore, says Mar Zutra, it proves that if you're allowed to use an 11 amma arava, then really it's already perched on the ledge. And that will be enough. That 11 then will be enough, because it doesn't have to make that extra 1 amma of vertical height. So I hope that's all as clear. That's what he wanted to show. And the Gemara says, yes, it's true that it was standing not on the ground, but on the first base. Just out of interest, if you go back to this picture, I'm trying to work it out. I couldn't see clearly. It could be that they're showing you this based on the top of the first ledge. We didn't see this clearly before, that this arava doesn't have its base on the ground, but rather on the ledge. And you can see here Cohen standing on the ledge. If that's the case, then they have correctly, sorry, I'm not sure you're sharing this one. You're not sharing this one, I should have shared, but 1 second. I just share very quickly again with you, sharing the wrong thing. I'm suggesting that even in this picture, you can see the arava not being on the ground, but actually being on the first ledge, in line with the way our Gemara is now explaining it. So it's already 1 amma off the ground where it originally stands. Okay, I will, you may unmute yourself now. Oh, mind you. Okay, and I'm going to stop recording. I can find the button.